My name is Ilara Vance. I'm 32 years old, and unlike most people, I spend my days living in the past. But wait! Before we dive into this story of secrets and twists, I need your help to keep this channel going. For us to continue bringing you stories like this every single day, your engagement is the only payment we ask for. It costs you nothing, just a single second, but for us, it makes all the difference. So, stop everything right now and smash that like button hard. If you aren't part of our Legion of Stories yet, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss a thing. And, so I know how far our stories are reaching, comment down below what city and state you're watching from. I want to get to know every single one of you. Done? Awesome. Now, get ready. My work is to be an archivist. I piece together forgotten lives from fragments left behind. Letters, journals, dusty first drafts. I suppose I chose this path because my own history is a blank page. An orphaned raised by the state, I have no archive of my own. So I find solace in preserving the legacies of others. My last project was the one that would redefine the very meaning of that word. Organizing the entire life's work of the legendary reclusive mystery author, Julian Croft. The journey to his estate was a story in itself, a ferry ride from the Maine coast, cutting through a thick, persistent fog that clung to the water like a shroud. The island emerged from the mist not as a paradise, but a jagged piece of rock crowned by a single, sprawling Gothic mansion, Blackwood Manor. It stood against the gray sky, its windows like vacant eyes, a place built for secrets. Julian Croft hadn't left the island in 20 years. At 80, he was a giant of literature who had chosen to become a ghost. He wasn't sick in body, but perhaps in spirit. A man who had written so much about the darkness of the world that he'd decided to shut it out entirely. My task, as explained by his Boston lawyer, was to bring order to the beautiful chaos of his genius before it was lost to time. The inside of the mansion smelled of old paper, sea salt, and wood smoke. Every surface was covered in books. Every room was a labyrinth of stacked boxes filled with manuscripts. And in the heart of it all was Julian. He was a tall, gaunt man with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that, despite his age, missed nothing. Our first weeks were a silent dance. I'd work in the cavernous library, sorting through decades of correspondence, while he watched me from his worn leather armchair, a silent observer. The breakthrough came when I found a series of unsent letters he had written to a rival author, a woman he had famously feuded with for years. The public letters were scathing. The private ones were full of respect, admiration, and a deep intellectual camaraderie. "You found those, did you?" he rasped one evening, his voice rough from disuse. "Yes, Mr. Croft," I said softly. "They're beautifully written." "She was a brilliant woman. The world loves a good fight more than a good friendship," he mused, looking out at the churning sea. "Paper holds the truths that voices are too afraid to speak, Miss Vance. Remember that." From then on, he began to talk. He told me the real stories behind his iconic characters, the true crimes that inspired his most twisted plots. I wasn't just his archivist anymore. I was his confidant, his confessor. I was the guardian of his soul. The only intrusion into our quiet world was his grandchildren, Pierce and Celeste. They visited quarterly like a mandatory tax assessment, their city-bright clothes and loud voices a violation of the island's peace. Pierce, the wannabe Hollywood producer, saw the archives as his personal goldmine. He'd corner me between shelves, his voice slick with false charm. "Elara, baby, listen, I know Grandpa has an unpublished novel in here somewhere. The Serpent's Tooth. The title alone is money. Just let me have a peek. We can be partners, you and me." When I refused, the charm vanished. "You know you're just the help. Don't forget who signs your paychecks. For now." Celeste was worse in her own way. An influencer whose life was a curated fiction, she treated the priceless history around her as a prop. I once walked in to find her with a first edition of Julian's masterpiece, its spine bent back, precariously perched next to a cup of matcha latte as she posed for a selfie. For the intellectual aesthetic, she'd explained, oblivious to my horror. Another time, she spilled a glass of red wine on a box of Julian's childhood drawings. "Oops," she giggled, dabbing at it with a napkin. "Guess that's what you're here for, right? To clean up old messes?" They called me the dusty librarian, the keeper of the junk. They saw me as a mousy obstacle, a gatekeeper to their inheritance. They never once asked their grandfather about his health, his work, or his day. They only asked me if he'd been making any changes to his will. Julian, from his study, would watch them come and go, a look of profound, wearied disappointment in his eyes. He never said a word, but I could feel his judgment, cold and silent as the island fog. One winter morning, I found him in his armchair by the fire, a book fallen from his hand. Julian Croft had written his final chapter. The grief was a physical blow. The arrival of Pierce and Celeste felt like a desecration. Their mourning was a brief, awkward pantomime before they started talking in hushed, excited tones about the estate and intellectual property. The meeting with the lawyer, Mr. Gable, took place in his formal Boston office. The air was thick with tension. Pierce and Celeste couldn't stop fidgeting. I was there by official summons, a fact that clearly infuriated them. "Let's just get to the numbers, Gable," Pierce said dismissively. "What's our cut?" Mr. Gable, a man who seemed carved from the same granite as the Maine coast, cleared his throat. "Mr. Croft's will is rather unique," he began. He explained that all personal assets, the properties, the stock portfolio, the cash, were to be divided equally between them. Pierce and Celeste exchanged a triumphant smirk, but the lawyer held up a hand. "However," he continued, his voice dropping, "Mr. Croft's will specifies that his most valuable asset, his literary legacy, which includes all copyrights, characters, published and unpublished works, and all future revenue generated by them, is not part of his personal inheritance. He considered it a living entity. It is to be governed by a separate document he and I prepared, the Charter of the Croft Archive Foundation." The smirks vanished. "What the hell does that mean?" Pierce demanded. "It means," Mr. Gable said, turning his gaze directly to me, "that the complete, total, and irrevocable control of the foundation, and therefore the entire literary universe of Julian Croft, is granted to its curator and director for life, Ms. Ilara Vance." The silence in the room was a vacuum. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. Pierce's face was a mask of disbelief turning into purple rage. Celeste's perfectly made-up face crumpled. They hadn't just lost a fortune, they had lost control of the name that gave them their entire identity. "This is a joke," Pierce roared, slamming his fist on the mahogany table. "She manipulated him. This nobody, this library rat." I stood up. The timid archivist who had spent years in silence felt a fire ignite in her chest. It was Julian's fire. "Mr. Gable," I said, my voice steady and clear, "the Foundation Charter stipulates that the island estate, Blackwood Manor, is the official and private headquarters of the Foundation, correct?" "That is correct, Ms. Vance." "Then please notify Mr. Croft and Miss Croft that they have 24 hours to remove their personal belongings from my property." The first few weeks were a blur of lawyers, accountants, and panic attacks in the dead of night. The mansion felt impossibly large, the weight of my new reality crushing. Pierce and Celeste, true to form, launched a vicious media campaign. Tabloid headlines screamed, "The Archive Vixen, how a scheming nobody stole a legend's legacy." They hired a literary expert who went on television to call me an amateur with no right to curate Julian's work. Mr. Davis, or Mr. Gable as I should call him now, became my general. Julian anticipated this, he assured me, presenting me with a locked file from Julian's computer. The password was the name of the rival author from the unsent letters. Inside was Julian's counteroffensive, a digital archive of every deceit, every act of greed, every betrayal his grandchildren had ever committed. Pierce, in his arrogance, immediately formed a media company to produce the Croft universe, starting with a gritty reboot of Julian's most famous detective. His lawyers argued it was transformative. I didn't fight him in the press. I fought him with Julian's own words. In the archive, I found a box labeled Legal Battles, containing Julian's meticulous notes on copyright law.
I used his own brilliant, scathing legal arguments from a past case to file an injunction. The court documents, quoting Julian's own definitions of legacy and copyright, were so airtight that Pierce's venture was dead on arrival, leaving him humiliated and in debt to his investors. Celeste's attack was more insidious. She used her massive social media following to portray herself as a grieving granddaughter robbed by a heartless employee. She posted tearful videos from a rented apartment, talking about her stolen heritage. Then, late one night, I found a hidden journal of Julian's. In it, he detailed his heartbreak over discovering that Celeste was blackmailing her own great-uncle, threatening to expose a long-buried family scandal unless he paid for her extravagant lifestyle. The journal contained copies of Celeste's threatening emails. I didn't leak them. I simply sent a copy of the journal to the great-uncle. 2 weeks later, his lawyers contacted Celeste. The money stopped, and the story of her extortion began to leak through the grapevine of the elite circles she so desperately wanted to impress. Her career as a lifestyle guru, built on a lie, imploded in a spectacular ball of schadenfreude. I had won, but the victories felt hollow. I was a fighter now, a strategist. The quiet woman who loved books was building walls around her heart. Was this what Julian wanted? The answer lay in the last place I looked. A hidden compartment behind a bookshelf in his private study, opened by a riddle he'd once told me. Inside was a single, leather-bound manuscript, his final, unpublished novel. A note was attached. "My dear Alara, this is the last story. The truest one. It holds my greatest secret. To publish it is to reveal it. The choice, as always, is yours." That night, a storm raged around the island, a reflection of the one in my soul. The security alarms blared. I found Pierce in the library, drenched and shivering, trying to pry open the safe where I'd stored the manuscript. He was a wild animal caught in a trap. He broke down, sobbing. All his rage was gone, replaced by a pathetic, raw desperation. It's all I have left of him. I thought if I had this one last story, I could finally be someone. Not just his grandson. Someone. I didn't call the police. I made him a cup of tea, sat him down in Julian's armchair, and opened the final manuscript. I began to read. It wasn't a mystery. It was a love story, a confession, the story of a young woman Julian had loved before he was famous, a woman he had abandoned in his pursuit of greatness. His great secret wasn't a crime. It was a lifetime of regret for a choice he could never undo. It was the most human, most heartbreaking thing he had ever written. As I read, I saw Pierce's face change. For the first time, he was seeing the man, not the brand. I published the book. Its raw honesty stunned the literary world and became his most beloved work. And I made Pierce an offer. He could work for the foundation. His first job, to go through his grandfather's early love letters and help me build an exhibit dedicated to the woman who had inspired it all. Not a blockbuster, but a quiet, truthful tribute. Today, the Croft Foundation is a beacon for aspiring writers. We fund libraries and underserved communities. We provide grants to voices that need to be heard. I, the dusty librarian, get to be the first reader for a new generation of storytellers. I didn't inherit a fortune. I inherited a purpose. I am the guardian of a legacy, and I learned that the best way to protect a legacy isn't to lock it away, but to let its truest, most human parts shine. And with every new story we help bring into the world, Julian Croft's spirit doesn't just live on, it breathes.
The story is over, but our conversation is just getting started. Now it's your turn to talk. I want to know 2 things in the comments, and I want honest answers. First, what would you have done in Alara's shoes? Would you have had the same vision for the legacy? Or would you have used the power and secrets of the archive for a more direct revenge? Tell me your plan. Second, what did you think of this journey? Was the twist satisfying?
Was the revenge just? Leave your full opinion on the story. If you made it this far, it's because this story moved you. So if you haven't already, show your strength. Hit the like button so more people see this incredible turn of events. Subscribe so you don't miss the next ones, and share this with someone who needs to see justice served. Your engagement is our fuel. See you in the next story.